All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Of course, actually, I have to give my own round of applause to everyone who's here and made it through the rain and through the LA Marathon traffic. Thank you for coming. I think it's really safe to say that I'm probably the only person on this stage who actually requires an introduction. So I'm Bonnie Poon, Manager of Public Programs here at the Fowler Museum, and welcome. And thank you, of course, again, for coming and for being so patient. And so just, if you would allow me, I have to say a few words of thanks to some of our funders before we get started. Jam Session, America's Jazz Ambassadors Embrace the World, is organized and circulated by Meridian International Center in Washington, D.C., and its Los Angeles presentation is supported in part by the UCLA Graduate Division, the UCLA School of the Arts and Architecture, Friends of Jazz at UCLA, Earl E. Gales Jr., Jenkins, Gales and Martinez, Inc., and the Shirley and Ralph Shapiro Directors Discretionary Fund. And co-sponsors include the Herb Alpert School of Music and the UCLA Department of Ethnomusicology. And our programming initiatives, including today's panel, were generously funded by the Ella Fitzgerald Foundation, the Ella Fitzgerald Charitable Foundation, and the Avant Lennart Public Programs Fund. And of course, we'd like to thank our media sponsor, KJazz, 88.1 FM, and also special thanks to our jazz friends who made our stage set upstairs possible. Remo D. Belli, CEO and founder of Remo Inc., Dennis Haggerty and Keyboard Concepts, String Season, Bedrock Studios, Eric Gill, Joshua Darlington, Byron Reynolds, and of course our very own Emery Thomas. And without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Tom Schnabel.
Thank you. Thanks for really braving the weather to come out today. The 405 at Sunset Boulevard, all of a sudden it became so dark that I couldn't hardly even see anything, and then there were the puddles and everything else. So thank you for coming out. Sitting backstage with our eminent panel, I usually don't get intimidated that we're talking and everything else, and Quincy and Kenny are catching up, and they've known John for a long time. I suddenly getting a little bit intimidated back there by the giants that I'm with, but I'm going to try to just move ahead. Quincy Jones, I mean, he doesn't really need an intro. I didn't know that he has won, is it 27 Grammys? Am I correct? Did I hear that correctly? Okay, 27. Probably another one on the way. And of course, he's produced some of the biggest records of all time. Of course, Michael Jackson's Thriller. My admiration comes from other places as kind of a jazz fanatic and a purist. I just asked him, and he graciously signed a copy of the Donaueschingen, Switzerland concert from 1960, where Quincy introduced Freddie Hubbard, who did an unbelievable solo on Stolen Moments. Beautiful album that was captured, and if I'm not mistaken, I think the complete European concerts of 1960 is also available as an import.
What's that?
The complete concerts of 1960 in Europe is now available as an import.
Yes.
And I hope you see a royalty payment from that. One never knows. But I also love Quincy for other reasons. There's a song that Quincy wrote called "The Midnight Sun Will Never Set," written by him and Henri Salvador, who was one of my favorite artists too. And Sarah Vaughan sings it, and you just say, "Oh my God!" I mean, it's just she could have she could have become an operatic singer if she wanted to. It's just so beautiful, and it's the flute doubles and the saxophone solo and everything else. It's so lush. So I mean, there's just no end to my esteem for him. There was a rumor floating around that maybe President Obama would name Quincy as our musical minister of culture. That still hasn't happened, and one of the things that we're going to ask is why don't we have a minister of culture here in America? There'd be no better person than Quincy Jones. Kenny Burrell, one of the giants of music, recording so many great records. His playing is admired by countless young guitar players, and you know how young guitar players, are sitting in the front row and trying to, to figure out, what he's playing. We're looking at, playing with Coltrane, Gil Evans, Ike Quebec, Jimmy Smith, Paul Chambers, and Quincy. Yeah, thank you. I can't say how many records Kenny's been on. His own discography is a mile long, but he's toured Poland, Czechoslovakia, in other places during the Soviet occupation. Remember, the USSR, especially under Stalin, put jazz musicians in prison. And it went back and forth. It's very interesting. But Stalin condemned jazz completely, and then Hitler condemned jazz. So then Stalin had to say, oh, this is great music. We have to embrace it because we hate Hitler. So it went on. And finally, when Stalin died in '53, all of a sudden there was this thaw. And there's so many people there. And we'll talk about that. These guys know 10 times more than I ever know. But anyway, I went to UCLA and USC, and there was no jazz department, and there was a guy named Paul Tanner that taught at UCLA, but now Kenny and Gerald Wilson and down at USC there's Alan Pasqua and Peter Erskine and all these jazz departments. I wish that they were around when I went to school, because there was nothing quite like it. So thank goodness the teaching is just so incredibly important. Our other panelist is John Hasse. He is basically he's the Smithsonian Institution's jazz guy. He is the author of the Smithsonian Anthology, which I think is just about to come out, something like that. He wrote a critically acclaimed biography of Duke Ellington, major study of jazz music called Jazz: The First Century. He's kind of been all over the place as an ambassador of jazz all over the U.S. as well as all around the world. So we're very happy to have him on the panel. I'm Tom Schnabel. I'm a radio guy. I do some books and features for PRI's The World, things like that. But the thing that got me into music was hearing John Coltrane's India on an Impulse album called Impressions when I was about 15 years old, and it changed my life, and it made me realize how deep music goes into my own young kind of idiotic spirit, and it never ever went away. So I'm here, and I'm very happy to be here. So welcome to our panelists. Welcome to you in the audience. I think, John, we'll sort of start with you, because you're going to do a short presentation of some of the things that you do with the Smithsonian, and then we're going to turn it over to everybody and explore this fascinating subject. I forgot to mention that when I used to interview, I started interviewing in 1979, and if you had a Russian pianist in or a Polish pianist in, or singers, they always mention how jazz was like the forbidden fruit, and how important, and how it represented not only this musical genius but freedom as well. So it's an incredibly wonderful subject and very, very under examined. So I'm glad that we're all here today. And John, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Tom. If you feel the slightest bit intimidated, I feel like the ringer on this panel. It's a great honor and pleasure. I've got about a 5-minute presentation about what the Smithsonian does in regard to jazz and cultural diplomacy. Most of what the Smithsonian does is at the National Museum of American History, where I've had the privilege of working for 27 years. We document jazz and cultural diplomacy, for example, through the vast Duke Ellington collection, which is 100,000 pages of music, another 100,000 pages of documents. Here's a program for when he performed in 1973, command performance for Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, and this is the medal that Emperor Selassie gave Ellington on that night. There's many photographs. Here he is in St. Petersburg, then Leningrad. Isn't that a wonderfully contrasting photo?
Yeah.
And here he is in India, listening to some Indian musicians. And here he is with Paul Gonsalves, the little repast.
Bubbly pipe.
You're right. And here is Mulatu Estatke in Addis Ababa 2 years ago. He's the father of Ethio jazz. He worked with Ellington when Ellington was there in 1973, and I had the pleasure of doing an oral history with him for the Smithsonian's collections. This Dizzy Gillespie's trumpet, you can see the references to playing abroad. And here is Cuba's great pianist Chucho Valdez a few months ago, backstage, if you will, at the Smithsonian, holding Gillespie's trumpet and being thrilled. He was a friend of Dizzy's. Quincy's gotten the chance to do that, too, come back and hold Dizzy's Gillespie's trumpet.
You gave me the original one. Gave me the original one.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. This is the French-Vietnamese Nguyen Ly, fine guitarist, again, backstage at the Smithsonian, checking out some of our jazz collections. We also exhibit jazz and cultural diplomacy. This is an exhibit that went around the world through the State Department. It's a poster show on Duke Ellington, still playing in various countries. Here it is in Cape Town, South Africa a few years ago. And we also celebrate jazz through cultural diplomacy, through Jazz Appreciation Month, which was kicked off in 2001 when Quincy came to the Museum of American History and helped us make the announcement of this new initiative. It's now celebrated all 50 states and 40 countries around the world, and two of the sponsors of Jazz Appreciation Month are represented today, the Ella Fitzgerald Foundation and the Herb Alpert Foundation. Rich Rossman and Fran Morris Rossman. Wave your hands. Thanks. The posters, each year we put out a new poster, and these are extremely popular around the world. I've seen them in grade schools, colleges, conservatories, radio broadcasting stations. We work with the State Department to send these out. And Jazz Appreciation Month is celebrated far and wide, from Australia to Russia. Here's a celebration in Estonia. Even sparked a jazz poster contest. Jazzaku means Jazz Month in Estonian, and little kids got involved throughout the country creating posters for Jazz Month. We work with the State Department, the Voice of America. Next month, the Voice of America is doing 10 shows throughout April for Jazz Appreciation Month. And through the State Department, we sometimes do digital video conferences. This picture was shot at the U.S. Embassy in Mauritius. There's a couple of local musicians playing, and then a little picture is I'm in the studio in Washington talking about Duke Ellington. They have a poster show there. This is also in Mauritius. They borrowed the State Department's exhibition on Louis Armstrong, which we helped to put together, and we've lent some photos to Jam Session, which you can see upstairs. The touring that we do has involved our jazz orchestra, which I'll get to in a moment, and I've had the honor of working in, 15 countries. There's a lecture on Ella Fitzgerald. This is students at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia 2 years ago. Here's a literally dirt-poor community school in Lusaka, Zambia, where most of the students are, extremely poor. This is one-on-one with a young lady pianist in Nairobi, Kenya, and some students and young musicians who had just heard a talk on Louis Armstrong, and inspired by Louis Armstrong, they said, life will never be the same. This is the power of American jazz musicians, even no longer living ones. This is a concert I did last year in Mauritius, and occasionally sitting in with local musicians and presenting jazz materials to Cuba. This was a couple months ago in Cuba. And here's our great jazz masterworks orchestra, founded by Congress 20 years ago, playing at the Alexandria, Egypt Opera House. There's our singer Dolores King Williams. This is through the State Department. And Chester Whitmore, a fine dancer from Los Angeles. We did a program for young people, and they were even more excited than their adult audience members. David Baker, our distinguished maestro, here working with members of a big band, and these musicians also double with the Cairo Opera Orchestra, and our bassist giving some pointers to the Cairo Opera Orchestra bass player. Also doing a program at American University in Cairo with local musicians, and most spectacularly playing in front of the pyramids and Sphinx. There's Chester Whitmore, Shantae, and here, Quincy, our piccolo players playing your soul bossa nova.
The swings.
It does. And finally, a 2-minute video clip of the band at the pyramids.
Great, you can just say, "Bap," take them back. Very nice.
It's a very interesting subject. Some of you, but certainly maybe not most of you, might remember the Cold War. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, the next door neighbor building a bomb shelter, going down underneath, and of course, are they going to let us come in just in case? And I mean, just a lot of scary stuff. And so the U.S. State Department, mostly Republican, there was Eisenhower and Nixon, and then of course Kennedy. Kennedy came in, not for that long, but anyway, the idea was Adam Clayton Powell. Let me try to figure this out. But we wanted to basically to extend our culture as a goodwill gesture to the rest of the world, and especially the world that might possibly lean towards the Soviet Union. The U.S. wanted to do it. Someone was thinking, well, let's send the ABT or the Balanchine or the Martha Gray and Company. And Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was a very, very cool dude, as far as I can recall. He said, no, they've got the Bolshoi Ballet. We're not going to do that. We can't out-Bolshoi them. We want to send the jazz musicians over because they don't have that, and that's all, of what they want. One of the very, very first tours took place in 1956. Dizzy Gillespie was going there, and I think he couldn't put a band together, or there was some issue. I don't know much about it, but Quincy Jones, who is here to tell the story, because he put the band together, and he was on that very first tour. So yeah, isn't that great? Tell us a little about it.
Well, Dizzy was traveling with Jazz at the Philharmonica with Norman Granz in Europe, and he didn't have time, and he said, I was 22 years old. This is a wild story, man. George Avakian, I was broken in the Ten Commandments. I just left Lionel Hampton. And New York is like Sinatra said, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. So he sent me, George Avakian sent me a dove. They didn't call them doves back then. What did they call them? They had another name back then, the technical name. Anyway, no, it was some little funny-looking record. And it was by a 17-year-old track jumper from San Francisco. And he wanted to do a jazz record.
Oh, yeah.
And I was very happy to get the job. Believe me, I was very grateful. And I started to work on it. Dizzy calls me to come out to Corona one day at 22 years old. Now, this is my idol all my life, since 13 years old. And said, do you think you could arrange to organize a band for me, pick the musicians, write the national anthem of each country, write a history of jazz, get the arrangers and all the stuff together? I almost fainted, I'm telling you. But I had this problem because I had to go back to George Avakian and say, George, I love you, man, but my nation is calling.
Gil Evans was appreciative. He got the gig.
It was Gil and Johnny Carisi and all those guys. They did the thing. And I told John then, too, I think it's a great singer, but I don't think he's a jazz singer. And they all did the record anyway. And we found out after we came back with Dizzy, and it turned out to be, after the record didn't work, what was his name? Oboe player.
Mitch Miller.
Mitch Miller called him upstairs. Chances are 12th another was Johnny Mathis.
Yeah.
And anyway, we went, we worked for 3 months in New York, and we met him in Rome. He met us at the airplane playing Sweet Lorraine to greet his wife, and it was the most incredible experience I've had in my life. We went to Iran, 1956. That's where they taught me how to do the beshkam. My fingers don't work anymore, and speak a little Farsi, because you would get slapped if you call an Iranian Arabic. He says, I'm Persian, and I speak Farsi. And we went to Abadan for 2 weeks. We tried everything they had. From Iraq, which is all around the Mediterranean, they have versions of the licorice, pasties, all around, everywhere from Turkey, all around there. And they have this Iraq, and I mean, it is strong, man. And they mixed it with, this guy had invited us to his house a lot, had a pyramid of oranges out in the back, which he let the sun silent ferment the pyramid, and then for 3 months, and it ended up like a brown tar. And he put the arak in some water and ice, and this brown tar, and I'm telling you, we were in trouble. Serious trouble. I didn't even know why we were in trouble, but we were in trouble. And it was the most amazing thing, because I learned then, and before I went with Lionel Hampton at 53 to Europe, Ben Webster gave me the greatest advice I've ever had in my life, which was, young blood, step into my office, let me pull your coat. That's what the beboppers used to say. Right. Step into my office, let me pull your coat. Let me tell you something important. Bass used to always say that too. And he says, wherever you go with Gates, who was Lionel Hampton, eat the food the real people eat, listen to the music they listen to, and learn 30 or 40 words in every language, And I'm up to about 18 or 22 now. And it's the best advice I ever had in my life. And so we were hanging around Abadan for 2 weeks, and then we went to Tehran. And the people in the United States didn't know who Dizzy was. They thought he was a baseball player. They called him Dizzy Dean. They didn't know who he was. And, you know, it just, that tour was astounding. And we did a good job over there, and they brought us back for the White House Correspondents' Ball. And then sent us down to South America, you know. It was amazing, amazing experience.
By the way, I want to remind you two things. Get yourself one of these programs because it's got all the photographs and it's got the story of everything, and it's just such a fantastic story. It's not a story that is nearly as well known as it should be. It has the photographs, and then go upstairs afterwards and look at the photographs and the posters and everything because they're absolutely fantastic. There's one of you, Quincy, I think in front of is it the Acropolis or somewhere where you're doing the Rodin Thinker thing, right?
Right.
Yeah, you got the.
Right.
That's so cool with your white socks.
Exactly. And I went to the barber shop that day, and I was tired, and I did like that to tell him to shave my mustache. I speak Greek now, but I didn't understand it then. And I woke up and I had a Hitler mustache. You know? Now I'm going to take it all off. You know? And Marshall Stearns was with us then.
Yeah, he wrote the story of jazz, which a lot of people read.
He was an amazing man. We used to call him the boss catter. He looked very, you know, very sophisticated and everything else, but he was one of the guys.
I just read the other day that the reason why Dizzy Gillespie's trumpet had the bell going upwards, and you probably already know this, but I never knew it. Apparently, he had two comedians opening for him in New York City, I think Stump and Stumpy, or Stump
Snookies.
No, Stump and Stumpy.
The club was Snookies.
Oh, okay. Oh, my God. Okay, I shouldn't be telling the story. Well, you know what happened, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Somebody sat on it, yeah.
What?
Somebody sat on it. It was on a stool, and somebody sat on it on the stool.
Yeah. And then he tried it, and he liked it, and wrote to the Martin Trumpet Company and got another one. Yeah. Kenny Burrell, you, of course, teach here at UCLA, which is really, really wonderful. As I mentioned, but you also went, you know, into the Iron Curtain countries, you know, during the Cold War. Right. And I'm sort of wondering two things of what, you know, what was it like for you, and how did people greet you, and what was your experience like?
Well, yeah, we were on tour. I was over there with a quartet in the late 60s, around 67, 68. And all of a sudden I got a call from someone at the American Embassy, said that we'd like for you to extend your tour since you're already over here. I wasn't really booked to begin with from the State Department, but they wanted me to extend since I was there already, because I guess we were doing a pretty good job, and they figured we were kind of well behaved, so they wanted us to continue. So I did that, and it was, you know, well paid and also a little scary, but I figured the security was okay. Anyway, we did it. And it was very interesting. What overwhelming to me was the people seemed so depressed when we were there. Just, you know, when we were on stage is one thing, but otherwise, when we were in the restaurants or in the hotel, there was this dark cloud over everyone. I just felt that people were certainly not happy at all with the situation. And then we had a few press conferences, which became very interesting, sometimes a little testy, because the young people who believed in communism at that time were, you know, here we were, American jazz musicians, and they were saying, well, I'll try to make it brief. They were saying, well, here you are in this country that's so prejudiced and so full of racism, and your music is suffering, you're always struggling, why don't you leave? You know, they don't treat you right, and they gave us some examples of other musicians who had moved to Europe and other things like that. Get out of there. This is, you know, it's obviously a terrible place to live. And to some extent, they were right, you know, because the climate here was not great, and there's still things to be fixed. But the point was, our attitude, and I remember expressing this on more than one occasion, was that there's a problem. Yeah, there are problems, but I'd rather stay there and fight the problem rather than run away from it. And so they had no defense for that. Yeah, I want to stay there and try to correct the problem rather than leave and the problem becomes worse, because as you know, in the 60s, you're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. And that was the kind of general attitude. And I and others, and I'm sure Quincy and all, we wanted to be part of the solution, and we have become part of the solution to various extents. So that was basically the nutshell of it, yeah, for me.
Did you have KGB types following you around and checking you in the hotel rooms next door, that kind of thing?
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was too busy trying to get the notes together, please. Concentrate. Get the good notes going on. But I'm sure that we were being watched and very carefully. But the other thing was just in terms of again, I said that people were depressed, but there were also a lot of people were very vocal about their dislikes and who was challenging who. And I remember being in Greece and in Cyprus. There was people would have these rallies all over the place, and country against country, and it was just incredible. But it's not. A lot of that is here we are today, and a lot of things have not changed. It may be, under different names, but it's still the same. And we're suffering as a species, And as Einstein said, we have perfected our means. We've confused our goals. So and we don't know what to do.
It's amazing you mentioned that. In a way, Disney's band was like the kamikaze black band that went over. They sent us to the worst places on the planet, man. I learned so much about the government, how everything works, There's hardship posts, number 1, 2, 3, 4, going from Greece. All the big money positions, contributors, even back to Joe Kennedy, England, France, Stockholm, Japan, they got those nice cushy jobs. Then we get to the ones where they deal with the alcoholics. They send them to hardship post number 1. And Greece was one of those places. The first guy we run into with Marshall Stearns, a guy named Duncan Emmerich. I'll never forget it. Most racist guy I've met in my life. He was a cultural attaché there. And he was so out of control that Marshall Stearns busted him, and we had to do depositions and took him to court. And they threw him out of there, but guess what? They put him in India, put him down in India, and I ran into him later. But they called in a big emergency to Disney one day and says we have to leave Anchorage, Turkey right after I met Arif Mardin and go to Athens because the kids from Cyprus were stoning the U.S. Embassy, and it was scary. And so we playing this concert, and this is 1956. And we played the concert, and right after the concert, about 400 guys rushed the stage and jumped all up on top of the stage. Kids, just like today. And we said, this is it now. But they turned the tables on us. And they put Dizzy up on the shoulders, and they said, Dizzy, Dizzy, Dizzy. And it was really shocking. And in each situation, we were learning something different about these cultures, because in Pakistan, they didn't even know what kind of instruments we were playing. We met Ravi Shankar over there and Chatur Lal. Anyway, that reminded me of that. And we did a good job. So when we came back to the White House Correspondents' Ball, we attended that, and they sent us down to Latin America, which is beautiful because we met Astor Piazzolla, Lalo Schifrin, and we ran into the beginning of Bossa Nova. Dizzy called me one afternoon and said, let's go down to the beach. He had on flip-flops and stuff, and we sat in with a samba band. And at that time, they were calling samba jazz and samba. Because if you listen to Desafinado, and that is Dizzy Gillespie. And Antonio Carlos Jobim was here. Astrid and Giles Gilberto was there. They were teenagers, And it was fascinating to see. Lalo warned me. He said the new wave is starting in Brazil. That's what bossa nova means, new wave, you know. And it was fascinating.
It's interesting. Wherever there is a dictatorship, there will be a distrust of jazz because it makes people want freedom, and that is the.
That's right.
I don't know whether I read this, so I'm going to kind of put it out there that Louis Armstrong was supposed to go to the USSR or to the Soviet Union when the Eagle Rock school desegregation crisis began in '57. He refused to go on this tour until the desegregation basically they desegregated the schools, and I understand that it affected the outcome. Is that true? Do you guys remember that?
Say it again.
That Satchmo, that they asked Satchmo to go to the Soviet Union on one of these tours, and then the Eagle Rock school desegregation crisis happened.
I remember that.
What did I say?
Rock.
Eagle Rock. I meant Little Rock. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm having a brain melt here. I'm sorry. I meant Little Rock. God help me. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, did it affect it?
Sure it did. Absolutely. Louis was a very conscientious man. And I was in my own little way, was one of his biggest defenders because bebop was really a counteraction to what the musicians had to do in Louis' time. They had to entertain, they had to smile, they had to sing and entertain at the time, and they didn't want to do that. Nat Cole was a jazz piano player at Jazz Philharmonic. I used to go when I was 13, and there's a story. See, but people forget that all the booking agencies, all of the record companies, all of the clubs were mafioso. Trust me, man, I worked for all of them. I stayed in Morris Levy's house. I worked with Frank Sinatra, I did Gicama, I know Horseface Nicovoli, Big Sneeze, I know them all. And it was, they owned the business, you know, so they didn't ask you what you wanted, they told you what you wanted. And Louis had Joe Glazer got 50% of everything Louis made. 50%.
I think that I've heard that is absolutely true, but it also tells you, and I'm glad we're bringing this up for this audience because it tells you something about the character of Louis Armstrong, who many people think he's just a smiling guy who plays the trumpet and entertains, but there was a lot of depth to this guy, and this is one example of it. And I think probably in terms of touching in terms of his spirit, that his biggest record, everybody gets a special thing from that. You know, What a Beautiful World.
Yeah.
What a wonderful
You're
world.
absolutely right. He was a big social consciousness, and very strong. But he's fighting a society he couldn't win in, you know, so he had to do what he could when he could.
There's a beautiful picture of Louis Armstrong being carried on a, what do they call it, a pallet or something, being carried in Kinshasa, Congo, and they're all carrying him through the city or the village.
They feel that spirit.
Oh yeah.
All over the world.
Yeah.
They still do in Africa. If you talk about Louis, if you play some music of his, you play some video clips, it's incredible how he reaches out over the decades, over the language gulfs, the generations, the miles and the decades, and grabs those young people. I even had some 13-year-old students who had ridden in a bus about 2 hours to come to a talk I was giving in South Africa. Some township students who were, had no running water in their
that goes way back to John, to Jim Europe and Eubie Blake, who's a very good friend of mine. I mean, he lived to 100 years old. They were the Queen of England, in the 20s. Duke and all of those people. It's astounding.
It's true.
That they come to, and to this day, one of my goals before I get out of here is to get a definitive curriculum for pure American music. I read a book a long time ago. It's put out by the United States Armed Forces, EM 603. It's called Discovering Music. It's a music appreciation book. And it talks and talks and talks and talks. And at one point it says, when it comes to jazz, forget about it, because it was created Jazz was created by an inbred, feeble stock race incapable of creating anything worth listening to. I know it by heart. And it would be much better off listening to the melodious strains of Chopin and Mozart. I've got it in a book I just put out. And that's got to change, and that goes right along with the Minister of Culture and the curriculum in the high schools, because it's a sociological situation. It's very complex, man. I mean, from Spain, the Berbers, and very complex.
The first things that, musicians like Ravel and Rachmaninoff would do after Carnegie Hall would be to go to uptown and go to the clubs, and they would want to hear what people were playing. And Ravel, of course, was very influenced by American jazz music. You can hear it in his G piano concerto in G. You can hear it in a lot and Debussy, of course. Yes, absolutely. What's interesting about all this is that, this is during the Cold War, so there's the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and there were some scary times, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we thought it might be all over. I remember going with my mother to the Hughes Market, and women were grabbing an entire shelf, like sticking their arm in and taking a whole shelf of can and just dumping it into the carts because people were frightened. So it was us and it was the Russians. That was one thing. But there was also, and I want to talk about Willis Conover, but there was also then all the newly independent African countries. And the Soviet Union wants to grab some of them because they couldn't really grab the Western European countries or there'd be another world war. So they're going after the Africans. So it's all very interesting. First, I want to ask you guys, there is a figure that's very important if you know a Russian person or a Polish person or a Czech Republic person, and that is Willis Conover, who did the Voice of American Jazz Hour, which was hugely influential, and it was broadcast into the Soviet Union and all the Eastern Bloc countries. Can you want to take that one, John?
Well, he started in 1955 and was the host of the Voice of America Jazz Hour for almost 40 years, and a sister program called Music USA. And, people like the Polish-born pianist Adam Makowicz said if it weren't for Willis Conover's broadcast, he would never have learned about jazz. They used to record these broadcasts behind the Iron Curtain on cassette, pass them around surreptitiously. And when he went to Poland one time, he was hoisted on people's shoulders and carried around as a hero. Well known behind the Iron Curtain, very little known in this country, and just did a great deal for the music for all those years.
The Hungarian Revolution used to do those together. And the governor, what's his name, Gabor Szabo? Yeah, he said that those programs saved his life.
Gabor Szabo.
Playing guitar with Lena Horne. It's unbelievable. I've shut up right now to this. but I'm telling you, there's some people, I don't care what anybody, everybody has a right to their feelings. If that hadn't been for the French, we wouldn't have jazz.
I read in Eddie
I'm serious.
Eddie Rosner was considered to be kind of the Russian version of Louis Armstrong, and he was in and out of prison most of his life because Stalin couldn't make up his mind whether jazz was good or jazz was bad. But there is a part there. There was a musician, a horn player, who saved up 10 years. This is like in the 1940s. 30s or 40s. He saved up 10 years to buy a Selmer alto saxophone. 10 years. He finally got it. There was a musicians union meeting where they had to turn in all their horns, and they were given cheap Russian clarinets and told, this is a real Russian instrument. You don't want to be playing that. So he had to give it up, and that was the situation there. But let's turn to the African concerts. Here are all finally, the African countries, nations are becoming independent. As you recall, they were carved up by the Europeans at the end of the 19th century across, tribal lines and everything, screwing everything up. It took them 60 years, 65 years, and finally they're becoming independent. And the Russians are looking at them and saying, well, we're going to give you tractors, we're going to give you seeds, and all this kind of thing. And then America decides, well, we're going to send our musicians there. We're going to send our jazz musicians there and win you guys over because this is democracy, this is jazz, this is freedom. Can I kind of just throw that out to?
Well, you just said it. I mean, it worked to some extent, but politically, the governments didn't change that much. You know, I think what has happened with this spread of jazz, which to me is, thank God for the recording and thanks for recordings and thank God for the all of those wonderful appearances that musicians have had and still have. You've got a direct sound from the spirit of a person, and that communicates with the spirit of other people, and it's spontaneous, and it takes you on a trip, and you can identify that as a human being. And this has changed the world of music forever. The world, the music in the world has changed it forever. And it's just a great thing, and I applaud Quincy for trying to do something in terms of the political aspect, the government, to try to institutionalize, and John always doing his best, but to try to connect this wonderful phenomenon, if the best word I can think of, to something that's built into the law and built into the educational system, because it's going to do nothing but plus. It's going to be nothing but good, and we've resisted it for so long. And I think the time is right. We've got the right president. We've got other people around that can do it, and I just want to hope that we all throw our support in that direction. And I don't mean to get off the subject, but Quincy's working really hard to get this done, as are other people, and I'm trying to do my job along with other educators in the universities. But this is a positive development that should be happening, and thank everyone to coming here today that supports this and understands it. Because I don't know whatever option, I don't know too many other options we have in terms of the spirit and the culture. I don't. And it's not just jazz. Jazz is connected to a lot of other kind of, but it's that spontaneous creativity that's just so wonderful.
Can I just clear this up? I saw a couple of people look at me like I was crazy when I said it wasn't from France. Not talking about the influence of the music. I'm talking about the sociological. That came from a sociological situation. Blues, jazz, all of that did.
Right.
It's not about an art form. The East Coast, when the slave ships came in the East Coast, it's back to that old psychology of you have to make midgets out of these people so we can feel like giants. They split the families up, and they wanted to kill the culture. They banned the drums in 1692. Now, in New Orleans, that didn't happen. Thank God. The Spanish and the French. They brought mulatto attendants with them, with the powdered wigs and all of that other stuff, you know. And this is after 1865. The Africans, the most powerful polyrhythmic concept ever on the planet. Just been freed, and vocal. South Africa, West Africa, where the drums come from, the percussion comes from. And the Spanish and French sisters had a little attitude, you know, because they'd been in a conservatory. Africans had never seen clarinets or trombones or trumpets in their life. They didn't even know what they were playing, you know. And they had a little attitude that they were a little better than the African slaves. And then somebody, you know, in this territory declared the Jim Crow law. Said, you're all black. And threw them in Storyville, if you figure it out. And I could see this scene now across there with the powdered wigs, you know, his brothers from Africa said, okay, how do we work this out? And Mutt Carrier, somebody picked up a glass and, you know, what do they call them? The plungers? The toilet.
The bathroom plunger?
The bathroom, yes. and everything to make those instruments sound like voices. And Duke Ellington, Don Redman, Benny Goodman, Benny Carter's told me these stories a million times. Adolph Sax created the saxophone 100 years before. He had no idea he was going to run the Shoeberry and Coleman Hawkins and Coltrane and Birdman. He had no idea. But Ravel used it in Bolero, you know, that's about it. And they invented another language. Sock cymbals, tubs with brooms and tuba inner tubes on it, everything, all this invention. Nobody had ever heard this sound before. And the French supported it, you know, they supported everything that was happening in Congo Square, you know, even after the problems that came with Jim Crow. And so it was very interesting. And I went to France when I was very young. And I experienced the same feeling over there, you know. I studied over there. So I just had to, but the ones that looked at me like I was crazy on this street.
I think it's true to say that without African rhythms and the Africans who came here, we would be listening to Scottish folk music and Gregorian chant.
Bagpipes.
Yeah, bagpipes. Bagpipes.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you about many different American artists went on many different tours. Satchmo, Dizzy, Randy Weston, even Ornette Coleman went. And I'm sort of wondering, Brubeck, of course, who, and of course yourselves, who in your opinion really connected with the people? With the people in Africa and in this wherever they went, Asia, Thailand.
They all know more about our music than we do. I'm serious. They know about Rimsky-Korsakov and Stravinsky, Shostakovich, and so forth in Russia, but they know our music there. I've been there, I've seen it. And you got to go to know. Japan, they had a doctor over there years and years ago that knew what was up. Now, it's interesting because China's a country of 1,300,000,000 people. They think that the stuff comes from Korea. Because they've been a powerful culture, you know, but they've only been connected with the free world 30 years. And it's a very, very interesting phenomenon, the whole thing. And you've got to go to know, you got to go to see it and feel it, you know.
I think, just in terms, I think most of the artists, we all did, but I think the record, I think Louis Armstrong did a lot, but I think Duke Ellington, and John can probably confirm this, Duke Ellington did most of the most tours, I believe, in counting.
I think you're right.
Yeah, and I think there was a reason for that he was asked to do the tours because he was successful in connecting with people on many levels. And he would say, you know, we do our best and we make our sounds, or he said something like our noise, and if they like our noise, then we're successful. So that, to try to answer your question, I think most people were well received. Duke Ellington, being very smart and very sophisticated, knew how to deal with various kinds of audiences of all levels, and I think that's one of the reasons why he was asked so many times.
What about, oh, sorry.
I was going to add, and Louis Armstrong had some incredible triumphs in Africa.
Right.
The poster, the photo in the jam session exhibition shows him kind of a jokey pose riding a camel outside the pyramids. But when he was in Belgian Congo in 1960, there was a civil war raging, and a truce was actually declared in his honor. Oh, wow. And the natives brought him into town, carrying him on a throne. And he was there when Ghana declared its independence from England, and a tumultuous crowd turned out. And some of these performances were documented by Edward R. Murrow in his documentary Satchmo the Great. So he's another one who had a big impact.
I heard a story once, and I want to see whether it's true or not.